source for tourism. And I don't think this really gets talked about enough. So for Arizona specifically, you can see a whole report that Tucson Audubon commissioned several years ago on our website. If you just go to the Tucson Audubon website and in the search box put, birding economics, you'll see this long report that broke it down by county. And what this report found, based on data that was gathered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was that birding, wildlife viewing, which can be primarily birding, generates $1.4 billion in economic impact to Arizona every year. So it is not just an amazing, fun activity that we all love and enjoy, and so many people love and enjoy. It also brings a lot of money into Arizona. And that's important to share as much as you can, since that is important to most people. Most business owners appreciate the fact that, hotel rooms are being rented and restaurants are being used because people are coming in here to view birds, to actually go birding. So I have a brief PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to share right now. Okay, share, and there we go. All right, so birding, what's the deal, right? So what is the appeal? Why do so many people enjoy this activity? I mean, it's the fastest growing outdoor activity. It's faster than golf now in Arizona. It's more popular than golf. So here we go. So birds are beautiful, right? We all love birds. For many people, birds have emotional connection or even a spiritual connection. Birds really speak to a lot of people. The amount of people I know in my life that are not in my bird watching world at all that will stop me and ask me about hummingbirds or whatever, just because people like birds. They're beautiful and varied. They're also everywhere. Birds do very well in urban settings. They come into our yards. You can see them pretty much anywhere you travel. And that makes birding really fun too, since any trip can have a birding component. And it's very little money is needed to enjoy birds. That's not to say people don't spend a lot of money on birds, because many people do, but to begin to enjoy birds, it requires very, very little money. So you can just set up a bird feeder in your yard, or even just go to a local park and enjoy seeing birds. And I think this is one of the most, underappreciated aspects of birding, is that it can provide an intellectual challenge for many people. So many people enjoy all the study and reason that goes into identifying a bird. And it can really help keep sort of the mind busy. And if you like puzzles or figuring things out, birding is really a really fun, rewarding intellectual challenge. And it's also incredibly varied in how you can do it. It can be very competitive. Many people are very competitive, and birding is very conducive to being competitive with others, or even just competitive with yourself, like trying to see more birds this year than you did last year. And it can also be incredibly relaxed. People can, I consider people birders or bird appreciators who just know the 10 species that frequent their yard or come into their feeder, and that's great. Or the fact that they just know that it's hummingbirds coming in, that is great. So it can be competitive as much as you want or as little as you want, and relaxed as much as you want. And it's a very friendly, warm, and I'd say giving community of people you can find with birding. I know many people who have made, lifelong friends through birding. And it really can be such a lovely group of people. And so it can have tremendous social implications too. People going to gatherings or regular group walks, and it can become part of your social life in a big way. And the most important thing is that birding is whatever you want it to be. If you want birding to be just, birding for you to mean just birding in your yard, or if you want to travel the world birding, it's whatever you want it to be. And there's room, it's a big tent. There's room for all sorts, all kinds and all sorts and all levels of birders. So many people will think of birders as a group that they're not a part of. But the thing is, most people, I'd say nearly all people, know a lot more birds than they think. So, for instance, these are just some sort of broad categories. Everyone, for the most part, knows what a duck is, or a hummingbird, or an owl, or a woodpecker, or an eagle. The amount of people that walk up to me describing what's clearly a red-tailed hawk, thinking it's an eagle in their yard, but still, they know it's a large bird of prey. They know it's either a hawk or an eagle. And then, of course, sparrows or little brown birds. So people know a lot more birds than they think they know. Like, I don't know any birds, but right out of the gate, children know a lot more birds than you'd think. So when you see a bird, you're out there birding. We're talking about some beginning birding things. How do you go about finding the identity of your bird, right? Because that's the number one thing people want to know. We sometimes do some general public outreach at places like the Saba Home Show. And it's one of my favorite parts of doing the Saba Home Show is the number of people that see us there with our Tucson Audubon booth and walk up with their phone facing forward to show us a photo of a bird that they took on their back fence or something. Because people really want, even if they don't think of themselves as birders, they really want to know the identity of a bird. So the first thing you want to do is stop. You want to look at the bird first and really notice the details. It's, especially with new birders, it's tempting to immediately pull that field guide out of your pocket or the app on your phone and start looking at birds that just to find something that looks similar. But the bird isn't going to stay there forever. So you really want to look at that bird first and notice details. Things like size, color, habitat, posture, and behavior are some of the first things you want to look at. So size, of course, is difficult because it can be incredibly relative. But is it, bigger than a sparrow, bigger than a crow? Things like that are the sort of size things you want to try to figure out. Now, the thing is, a cedar waxwing and a blue jay in silhouette can actually look pretty similar, but it's the size that can really separate them out. Now, size is incredibly tricky field mark, which we'll talk about later when you get into more advanced birding. But right out of the gate for new birders, if you see a bird in the park walking around on the grass and you know how far away it is, so you can kind of tell how big it is, this is when size can be really very helpful. Also, so this is a photo showing some birds in silhouette, and there's actually a lot of information here. So we can see in silhouette the shape of the birds. Now, these birds are all sitting on a fence, so we can tell that they're all at the same distance from us. So relatively to each other, how big are they? And also their behavior, where they are. The fact these birds are on a wire, these in a tree, these on a fence, this one on a fence post, this one climbing a tree. So this one climbing a tree gives us a good clue that this is a woodpecker, right? So behavior and these quail on the ground. So behavior is a huge, huge clue, as well as general size, shape, and posture for these birds, which we'll talk about next. So behavior in terms of how birds hold themselves can be incredibly helpful. So here's a wren with its little tail cocked up, and then on the right here is a flycatcher with its tail held down. Flight pattern can be very, very helpful too. So sometimes new birders will marvel that more experienced birders will just see a bird out of the corner of their eye and be like, well, that was a woodpecker out of the corner of their eye. And this totally seems, marvelous to newer birders. How did you know that? Well, a lot of it is just experience and understanding that things like flight pattern can have a huge clue into the identity of a bird. So this example number one here is supposed to be like a woodpecker doing their undulating flight, where they'll reach a peak in their flight, sort of fold their wings and fall, go into a bit of a free fall, a curve down, flap again, and go up onto a peak, and then do it all over again. So they have this sort of up and down flight. And then we have things like mourning doves, number two here, which has a very powerful, direct, straight line kind of flight. And then things like this kingfisher, which is hovering over water to see, to try to see fish below to dive in on them. And then things like, so this is a classic example of the brown creeper going up a tree limb, the woodpecker going up a tree limb, and the nuthatch going down. So even behavior in terms of what direction they're moving can be very relevant and a first clue towards the idea of a bird. And then ducks. Is it a duck that is diving down low where it disappears under the water? So it'd be diving ducks. Or is it a dabbling duck, which is a category of ducks where they sort of upend? We've all seen this in a park, where they upend and then their little duck butts are showing over the water, but they're just sort of grabbing some vegetation, some shallow vegetation below the surface. So these are all good visual cues to help us identify birds. And these are really the first things that we should tackle. And then flight again. So there's an accipiter, it'd be like a Cooper's hawk, flying very straight and direct. And then things like a red-tailed hawk or a zone-tailed hawk, circling up into the sky. How birds hold their wings can also be incredibly relevant when you're talking about birds of prey. So bald eagles holding them flat and turkey vultures having that diagnostic V shape. So birding does have some logistics to get started. I think one of the most important things to get is a field guide. So books for identifying birds are known as field guides. There's a lot of different choices. There's birds that have photos, birds that have drawings, and there's also apps. So there's a lot of different choices. These are some of the more, I think, well-known choices. National Geographic has a field guide, so does Sibley, field guide to birds of Western North America, or they have one for Eastern and then for all of the US. And then this nice local book, Birds of Southeast Arizona, by Rick Taylor, which I think is quite an excellent one, especially for beginning birders. And they all have different strengths. So some use art. So this is sort of one using drawings and the kind of the old, relatively traditional plate format where you have all the drawings on one and then all the information on the left. More plates, but this are incorporating photos. And then this one is all from Sibley. This is all art that was done by Sibley with the maps and the info below. So it's just important to note that taxonomy rules field guides, that most field guides work in a taxonomic order, which basically means sort of birds going from what's considered most primitive to most recently evolved. So how they generally go is ducks to hawks to hummingbirds to passerines, which are songbirds. But this has changed over time. All these categories have been sort of mixed up, especially recently with some DNA information that has come out. But based on when your book was published, it's going to dictate the order that the birds are in. And the reason I mention this is often very confusing for new birders that don't understand why birds that seem so similar are not really that close to each other in the book. So the falcons are not usually next to the hawks, even though they look very similar. And the swifts are not near the swallows, even though they can really seem very similar to each other out in the field, because it has to do with sort of the order, their taxonomic genetic order. So range is a concept that's very important to birding, and one that I think new birders, if they can understand this, it makes things a lot easier when you're trying to understand what birds you're seeing. So these are two birds that look very, very similar. It's a Cassin's vireo and a blue-headed vireo, look very similar. But when you look at their range maps, which shows where they occur, you can really see that based on where you are, you can rule one out over the other. So it's important to note too that so these Cassin's vireos are in the west and the blue-headed vireos in the east. So based on your location, and also the different colors denote what time of year those birds are around. So blue for winter, yellow for migration, and red for breeding usually. And then the front of your field guide that has these maps will tell you what color means what. And season's also quite a key. So range can be really much driven by elevation as well. So a really common ID struggle here in Southeast Arizona is Western screech owl versus whiskered. These birds look very, very similar. And it's usually dark. Now they sound quite different, but if you see one roosting, there is some physical differences. For instance, whiskered has a pale bill versus Western having a dark bill, but the real cue is going to be elevation. So whiskered screech owls tend to occur above 4,500 feet, while Western screech owls are below 4,500 feet. So range can be drawn on a map, but also elevationally driven. And also habitat type is a big one. Are you in the woods or the desert? And the thing is, sometimes rarities do happen. You know, really incredible rarities have been found sometimes by beginning birders who get a photo. But it's also really important to keep in mind what is likely with what you're seeing. So this bird here on the left looks a lot like this one on the right. They really very much looks like a bush tit. And this is a common thing that happens where people and birders will see this sort of what this bird looks like on the left, will see that in their yard and think, oh, I have a bush tit in my yard. How great. Usually they're only up in higher elevations, up like on Mount Lemmon. But I have one in my yard in urban Tucson. But what they're actually seeing is a young verdin, which can look very similar to a bush tit and is a common bird of the Tucson Valley. So tools of the trade, it doesn't take a whole large amount of money to start, and you can get a good pair of binoculars from $200 to $300. Tucson Audubon has an excellent selection of binoculars in our nature shop. 8x30 is a standard. Now the thing is, people will, you can get good binoculars to start with for $200 to $300, but people who really get into birding can buy binoculars that cost in the thousands. So there's definitely a huge price range, but really very solid, decent binoculars can be found in the $300 range. And if you're new to binoculars, make sure you look up how to use a diopter correctly. It's really quite important to help with your frustration, your success of birding, is to learn how to use your binoculars quite well. And that diopter is definitely a key to that. And then some birding etiquette is, I think, important to talk about for new birders too, where you really want to be move slowly together, keep voices low. You don't want to scare the birds is the main thing. And then the whole idea of the clock method, I think, is really very important, where here's a tree. The first thing is indicating which tree. You see a bird. Oh, I see a bird. You want to make sure you don't talk too loudly or point at the bird because you're excited, because that can often scare them off. So what people use then is what's called the clock method. And you'll often see field trip leaders do this or guides do this. And what they mean is that the face, imagine the face of a clock over the tree or whatever object the bird is sitting in, and you can indicate without pointing at the bird, oh, it's at 2 o'clock, like this bird is at the 2 o'clock position on that tree. So that's a very important concept, one that I think oftentimes gets neglected and people stopping to explain. So when they say a bird's at 8 o'clock, they mean imagine the face of a clock projected onto the object you're looking at, usually a tree. And the main thing is to just get out there. You know, you got to get out there birding. And I tell new birders this all the time, that the more you do it, the easier it gets. And it's really very true. And getting out there is really key. It helps you meet people, and just the more you do it, the easier it gets. And Tucson Audubon offers free field trips. During normal times, we offer quite a lot of free field trips. But of course, now we're doing online stuff. But, you know, in a normal time frame, a lot of free field trips. And then there's also a lot of birding festivals in Southeast Arizona that can be covered. And so the Verdi Birdie Birding Festival up near Dead Horse Ranch State Park in April, Southwest Wings out of Sierra Vista, May and August. And then Tucson Bird and Wildlife Festival, which is the one Tucson Audubon does, is in August. And then Wings Over Wilcox is a really fun festival that's back in Wilcox. And that is every January. I have it if you need. So another really fun thing you can do for new birders is to make your yard birdie. So if you plant native plants in your yard, and especially ones that are food producing for a lot of birds, that can really bring birds close to you. And that can be really fun and effective for learning some birds. So back to you, Richard. So now we're going to talk about some more advanced sorts of things. Can you see us again? Wave if you can see us. Are we here? Okay. All right. Okay.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm just going to cover a few things that I think perhaps sort of just expanding on what Jenny's already been discussing there. And just as general birding tips, there are lots of different books and guides that we can look at. And one of them that I really like, and I'll show it to you later, is a book by Ken Kaufman. And Ken's obviously a very well-known birder in North America. And so quite a lot of this information here really comes from his book. And as I was reading that for the first time, I was thinking, yes, this is exactly what I've always been thinking about birding. So I will share those thoughts, which are mine and Ken's between us. I think he probably put it better than I ever could. So I think the first thing that I always say to people is that it's okay to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. I do this for a living. And I'll make mistakes every day because it's hard. This is a tough thing. Trying to identify birds can be really difficult. So don't think that you're going to get everything right, and don't beat yourself up too much when you make a mistake, and that's going to happen. So as long as you're able to accept that this is going to happen, then you can move on. One thing that I do hear quite often is that people will say to me, well, I don't really do birding by ear. I just look at birds. I don't really do birding by ear. And that can be a mistake, I would say. It's very important, if you want to become a better birder, to start birding by ear. Now, I do it all the time. That's how I do most of my birding by ear. So I hear birds, and I'm able to, you're surrounded by common bird sounds all the time. And that is the best way of starting to learn how to bird by ear, is by familiarizing yourself with the common bird sounds in your yard. You don't even have to know what those birds are. You're like, that woo sound. Oh, I don't know what it is, but I hear it every day. So that's important, because if there's suddenly a sound that you've not heard before, you think, well, that's something different. That's something unusual. Maybe I should track that down. So that's how I spend a lot of time birding, is I'm hearing the common birds. I'm kind of filtering those sounds out so that we can concentrate on perhaps what, my clients might want to find. We're out looking for a trogon. I don't want to have to think, oh, okay, Gila woodpecker, Gila woodpecker, Gila woodpecker. So I'm filtering those sounds out because I've become familiar with all those common sounds. So that, I think, can be, firstly as well, people always know a lot more than they realize, definitely. So people that say, I don't know anything about sounds, you do. As Jenny was saying earlier about people that don't know anything about birds, they actually do know more than they think. So the same could be said with bird songs, calls, any vocalizations, that people probably know more than they realize. And not to be too scared about it. People see it as an impossible subject, and it really isn't. You already know more than you think you do. So just familiarize yourself with the common sounds. Don't stress too much on whether you can tell which one's which. Just know that they're the noises that you hear normally. And then something unusual presents itself audibly, you will pick that up. You'll think, oh, that's something. I've not heard that noise recently, or I don't remember hearing that before. And then you can know to concentrate on, well, let's find this bird. It might be something quite interesting. One of the keys to identifying birds that I think people sometimes can sort of skip over is the fact that you need to really have a suite of features. And there's often one good feature. So an example would be people will look for a breast spot on a sparrow. Think, oh, it's got a breast spot, therefore it's going to be one of these ones. It can't be any of these. Now, that can sometimes be misleading. So it's a good feature. That's always a good feature, but it's not always the one and only feature. So just as an example, a bird with a breast spot, those features, they're only on a couple of feathers. What if it's molted those two feathers and it doesn't have a breast spot? And you're saying, well, it can't be this because it doesn't have a breast spot. Well, look at the rest of the bird. Look at more than one feature. Or you say, look, this bird has a spot on its breast. It could have just had a bath. It could have a little wet patch. It could be a bit of oil it picked up. So that one feature is great, but combine it. Look at lots of other features. The same can be said, for example, with a bird that appears to have a crest or a raised crown feather. You've got these feathers sticking up here. Well, birds will do that. Nearly all birds will raise their crown feathers as an expression. So if you watch a roadrunner, for example, a lot of the time it's got its crown very much flattened, but very frequently they are intrigued or provoked by something and the crown feather pops up. Flycatchers do it all the time. So sometimes people will send me a photo saying, what's this bird? It's got this big crest. And it's just a bird with its crown feathers raised. Sparrows do it, so many birds do that. So don't rely on just that one thing. Well, it had a crest, therefore it must be a cardinal or a phainopepla. Well, it could be a sparrow, just with its crown feathers raised. The next frame could be a photo with its crown feathers down. So keep an eye on the whole bird. Look at all the different features. Don't just get hung up too much on one feature. There are two basic schools of thoughts when it comes to identifying birds, which I don't think anybody really uses one or the other completely. You have to use them both, which is the general impression versus what you might call the feather edges approach. And so as an example of that, somebody might come up to me and say, well, I've just seen this bird and it's got these big white spots on the end of its tertial feathers, and I think it's a flame-coloured tanager. And they pointed out to me. I'm thinking, well, yeah, it's got the white spots on the tertials, but it's also the rest of the bird's white, and it's massive, and it's swimming on a pond. I think it's a swan. Now, he's not wrong to say that white tertial edges on a flame-coloured tanager would be a good ID feature, but you've got to look at the whole bird and think, well, it's clearly a swan. So that's an extreme example, but that you can see the sort of road that we're going down there, that you can get too far into the weeds and think, well, no, but this feather here is not what I was expecting, therefore it can't be this bird. That's not always totally reliable. Again, looking at the other way, I had an impression it was this. We're ignoring the fact that it's got a big long beak, and I'm thinking it's a dove. So you've got to go somewhere between those two. Often your first impression is correct, but then use the finer details to kind of back up that first impression. Context is really important. So that's when it comes to finding a sparrow. Down by the river here, the Santa Cruz River here in Tubec, for example. And I'm right by the river. There's a sparrow jumping around. I can't see it very well, but I'm already thinking to myself, well, it's right by the river. What sparrows tend to be right by the river? Well, song sparrow. That's common, right by the river. And it jumps out, and yeah, it's a song sparrow. They're there year round. And that's exactly the habitat I'd expect them. Now, I live a mile away from the river. I've never had a song sparrow in my yard here, and I don't expect to get one, because they do not leave a sort of wetland environment. They really are tied to that habitat. So once you know that, and I've got a sparrow here in the yard, I've already sort of ruled out song sparrow, because it's very, very unlikely to be a song sparrow. So that sort of thing, the habitat, the season, you know, if we're looking at a bird and it's just something small and grey and it's going through a mesquite tree and it's November or December, you know, there's probably more chance of that being a verdin than being a Luce's warbler. Luce's warbler is a summer migrant. They arrive in March. They leave in sort of September time. And you're almost never going to see one outside of that time. So knowing that is really important. The bird's behaviour. If the bird is sitting at the top of an obvious perch and fly catching, excuse me, it's probably a flycatcher. It's probably not a wren. Wrens don't generally do that. So again, knowing just these details can all help add up to this identification. And the location as well, especially here in Southeast Arizona, where we have this really wide range of habitats, the diversity of elevations. It's probably a different bird from the desert than if you're at the very top of Mount Lemmon in a pine forest. Just added on to the end of that, it's worth noting, of course, that rarities happen. Birds go wrong. Things are not always where you expect them to be. So bear that in mind. Most of the time, they're pretty good guidelines until it isn't, until a song sparrow appears in our yard one day because it went funny and decided to go and see what the desert looked like. So those things can and do happen, but they tend to be rare, which is why we call them rarities. You know, that we're not expecting to find a rarity every day or to see something in a completely wrong time of year or wrong habitat. It does happen, but they're rare. So that's bear it in mind, but don't rely on it. Learning the different parts of a bird is really important, and the more people I take out, the fewer people I see that actually know this. This was something that when I was a kid was a really standard thing, that you learnt all the different feather tracts. And it's not difficult to do. Every field guide, every bird book there has got the illustrations at the start that will point out the different parts of a bird. And it's not that hard to figure out. They are different on different birds. So, for example, this is the Sibley guide here. You can see this is a gull that he's got there with all the different... and you can look in your own field guides. Everyone's got these.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, so these sorts of things. Now, it doesn't take that long to learn these things, and they're really important. One of the reasons that they can be very important is that if you are looking for a flame-coloured tanager, and someone says, oh, don't forget, they've got the white spots on the tertial feathers, and you're thinking, what? Is that on the head? Is that on the tail? So if you know where the tertial feathers are on the wing, you'll know to look for those white spots on the end of the tertial feathers. If this tanager appears in front of you and it's clearly got these white spots on its tertial feathers and you know where they are, that's going to help you. That's going to help you no end. You know, people talk about primary projections. Do you know what the primaries are? Where are they on a bird? What part is their wing feathers, but which part of the wing? And the more you understand, the easier that gets, because people will, you know, talk about these things and they'll be mentioned in field guides and text and things that you're trying to learn from. So if you don't know what the belly is versus the breast, what the flanks, you know, where the flanks are, what's the which different stripe is which on the head, then you're at a disadvantage, and it's not that difficult to learn that. So I really highly recommend that that's something to pay attention to. Learning to look at birds in a way that encompasses the whole bird. It's just human nature to, if we meet each other in the street, we're going to look at each other's faces. That's how we recognize each other. That's what we focus on. And we do the same with birds. We look at a bird's face. Now that may not be the feature to identify that bird. So we sort of look at its personality before we do anything else. Now, if that bird's not going to be there for very long, you want to really check it out all over. How long's the tail? What colour are the legs? It's a difficult skill. It's something you have to teach yourself to do. It really helps as well to know if the type of bird you're looking at. So, for example, I take clients out all the time, and everybody's favourite, an Empidonax flycatcher will appear in front of us. And, you know, the usual reaction, of course, is to groan. Oh, no, this is going to be impossible. And people will think they're helping me by saying, oh, yeah, okay, we've got to ID this. Yeah, it's got an eye-ring, and it's got 2 wing bars. Well, they all have an eye-ring. They all have 2 wing bars. When I see an Empidonax flycatcher, I know straight away, look at the bill. Look at the primary projection, the length of those wingtips. Look at the tail. Look at the behaviour. Listen for a call. That's really important. It doesn't matter that it's got a wing bar or 2 wing bars and an eye ring, because they all do. The plumages can be quite variable if it looks quite dusky or it doesn't look that dusky. You're looking at these finer details. So knowing that for certain birds, for certain types of birds, you know, if you present with the shorebirds, you're looking at those differently. You're thinking, right, okay, bill length and those sorts of things, rather than the perhaps more obvious things. So that's getting a bit more advanced, is to know that ahead of time, so that when that Empidonax flycatcher appears in front of you, you're not just thinking, oh yeah, it's got 2 wing bars, and then look through the book to see which one's got 2 wing bars. They all have 2 wing bars. So that's a really useful trick, certainly. Absolute field marks versus relative field marks. This is an interesting topic. And I decided to use Bendire's thrasher as a good example of this. So curved-billed thrashers and Bendire's thrashers are very similar looking birds. They live in very different habitats. That's a really good clue. They've got different songs. However, if you're just looking at a thrasher and you're trying to figure it out, there are lots of things in the field guides that will say to you, well, Bendire's tends to have a more yellowy eye, and curved-billed tends to have a more orangey eye. Curved-billed tends to have a more curved, longer down-curved bill. Bendire's tends to have a straighter bill. Bendire's tends to have little chevron markings on the breast. Curved-bill tend to have blurry spots on the breast. Bendire's tends to be a bit smaller, with slightly shorter tail. Those are all subjective things. They can all help. Adding all those things together is great. Bendire's thrasher really only has one absolutely cast iron guaranteed field mark, which has got a pale grey base to the bill. Now that's something that's not subjective, that is objective. You can look at that and see that that is the case. It has a pale grey base to the bill. Unless a curved-bill thrasher has got a bit of dust on it or something like that, it won't have that. So you've got these 2 different types of field marks. Sometimes you have nothing but subjective things. Empidonax flycatchers tend to be that example, unless they're calling. The call is the objective one. That is going to be that bird because of that call. Otherwise, you're looking at all these tends to this, and you know, more often than not is that. They get a lot more difficult. So if you've got there's a thrasher just appeared outside the window, trying to not be distracted by curved-bill thrashers. So if you've got one of those really solid field marks, really look for that if you can. If you get close enough to a Bendire's thrasher, you see that pale grey base of the bill, all the other things seem to fit as well, then that's great. You know you've got a Bendire's thrasher. There are optical illusions. That's a really big thing. We see this all the time, and that can happen to the most experienced birders. And I see it every day. You'll look at a bird in bright light, and then it hops into the shade, and it looks a different colour and a different size, and then it turns and it looks twice as big. And the same bird then jumps slightly towards you, and it looks a lot bigger, and then it hops up onto a different branch, and it looks a different shape. And that is just something to get used to and to acknowledge that it's going to happen, because it continues to happen. A bird with a shadow across it, you think, oh, this bird's got a completely black head. Well, no, it's just got a shadow across its head. So expect these things to happen, and the more that you sort of get used to that, the more you can kind of filter that out. You think, oh, okay, that's probably not a real field mark. That's probably just the angle it's at, for example. So those things are difficult, and they are challenging. Every time I go out birding, I'll be faced with those. But it's the more you just acknowledge that these things happen, the easier they are to actually sort of deal with. I'm gonna mention molt extremely briefly. I know that we're running out of time here. Molt is a very, very huge and very, very complicated subject. It's one that I'm not fully understanding of. There's a big book written by Steve Howell, and I've not got past the first few pages. It is just too complicated. It is important to understand some aspects of molt when you're identifying birds. I don't want to get too much into it here. We'll probably just leave it at that. It's a big subject and probably for another day, really. Yeah, let's not even go there. The final thing I would like to say on this section is that, almost going back to the start, the first thing I mentioned, where it's okay to make mistakes, it's also, you're going to have to leave some behind. I'm, you know, as a guide, a professional guide, people sometimes expect me to be able to identify 100% of the birds that I see and hear, and I can't. That's just a simple fact. That's the reality of life. If a hummingbird whizzes over my shoulder, what was that? I think it was a hummingbird. I'm not going to put a name on it, and that we may not see that bird again. We have to just accept that one's gone. So it's a bit like going out fishing. That's the one that got away. There's always going to be several that get away. So again, the more accepting of that you become, some people get very frustrated by that. Don't allow that to frustrate you. That will happen. You know, just some of them were just like, yeah, that was a bird. Great, let's move on. Right, over to Jenny.
So that was our section on some more advanced bird ID tips from a professional guide. But one of the most important things that people ask Richard, as well as myself, we'll call Tucson Audubon, is where to go birding. This is always a thing that people want to know, not just visiting birders, you know, people who live here, is where can I go and see some great birds? So we wanted to cover some resources on that help you figure out where to go see birds. Go ahead, Richard. So
okay, good. And many of you will be familiar with this. This is Tucson Audubon's Finding Birds in Southeast Arizona guide. As far as Southeast Arizona, this is the book you need, and this will tell you so many different places to go birding. It's invaluable. I can't recommend this highly enough. Another good one that we've already mentioned here is Rick Taylor's book, Birds of Southeast Arizona, this little pocket-sized field guide. And that's really good in terms of not only giving you, and I've just opened it on Berylline Hummingbird, which is a good one because there is one currently in Madera Canyon that's being seen by a few people. You can see these little bar graphs here. They'll tell you the season of occurrence and the elevation. And Rick will mention the habitat. Those, if you want to know where a certain bird is, that information really gives you an advantage.
There's also some online resources that can be quite good. So there's the Arizona, New Mexico listserv, which is one that's been around for many years, where people can, almost like an old email tree, where people can share what birds they're seeing. And then you can either go to their website and see that, or get those emails directly. So that's kind of an old-fashioned method that's still in use. There's also Facebook. So there's several groups on Facebook. There's the Arizona Birding Facebook group, as well as, you know, Birding Arizona in the Southwest. There's several Facebook groups that you have to sort of apply to be a part of, you know, to request to be added to, that have a lot of users, and people share photos and all sorts of great information. The first place I heard about the Berylline hummingbird that was seen just, you know, several days ago in Madera Canyon, and then people asking for updates on its status, was in the Arizona Birding Facebook group. So that is a really sort of modern, cutting edge way to get information on what birds are being seen and also where to go. And there's also, of course, eBird. I don't want to spend too much time on eBird, since I know there's been several classes on this platform dedicated to eBird. But eBird is free. It's one of the easiest ways to access it is through their website, ebird.org. It's from Cornell, and they have an explore option, and you can explore hotspots near any location in the world and see what birds are being seen there, as well as with a color coding system, which hotspots have the most species. So that is a really great way, for absolutely no cost, to find out where to go birding near where you live or near where you're visiting, which is really very cool feature of eBird. And I would also say that a really fun thing to do with birding is to find a patch. So this is a concept you hear a lot with British birding, and they talk about it more and more. So even before I knew Richard, I was familiar with the patch concept, where, and I think a lot of us do this anyway, where we bird in our yard or at a nearby park, like a favorite place that we bird frequently. and go back to again and again. And you can really see changes in season and get to know the local birds of your area, which can be really important, because then that can definitely help you know when you're seeing something unusual, is by knowing what's usual in your area. Let's see, then you're going to talk about talking to other birders.
Yeah, that's another place of getting information, is just talking to other birders, which is always very useful. But then I would add a little caveat there in terms of, and I'll use this example. I had a kind of an argument with a guy in front of a whole load of people once at Santa Rita Lodge, because I think I mentioned out loud about a good place to go and see Montezuma quail. And this guy said, no, the best place is where I saw Montezuma quail. And he mentioned a place that I didn't think was going to be a very decent, you're going to get them there occasionally, sure. But because he had seen it there, then he thought, well, that's the best place to see it, because that's where I saw it. So people will tell you that when they've seen the bird there, they say, well, that's the best place to go. You could say likewise with the wintering male elegant trogon in Madeira Canyon, and that bird roams up and down the canyon all day long. It can be anywhere in a 2-mile stretch of canyon. It's got no particular pattern to it, but the people you just spoke to, they saw it by this bridge at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So you must stand by the bridge at 4 o'clock if you want to see this. Not necessarily the case. So people can give you some really good information, but be a little bit aware of that sort of what I was going to term experience bias. That's where I saw it, so that's where you should go. The success bias.
Yeah. So then we thought another fun thing to cover as we're drawing to a bit of a close here is Richard's advice on having a good birding day as a professional guide in Southeast Arizona.
Okay, so we all know that we've got to get up early in the morning, right? That's very much the case if we're out in the spring and the summer. Definitely the weather, the temperature here, the birds are active early morning. It's going to ease off as you go throughout the day and become almost impossible during the afternoon. That's less important in the fall. In the winter, there are birding opportunities all day long, and there's a couple of particular examples where you don't want to be up too early in the morning, even in the summer. And because of our canyons, we have certain canyons where the sun does not come up and warm the canyon until an hour or 2 hours after sunrise. I have met people, I arrive at, say, Florida Canyon, looking for rufous cap warblers. I'll get there an hour and a half after the sun's come up, because there's very little activity until the sun has come up over that canyon wall. I'll see people leaving saying, oh, it's really quiet in there today, I don't know where these birds are. They've just not woken up yet. There's birds that eat insects. Insects are not going to get up till the sun's warmed them up. So there's very little activity, even in the summer, in some of these sort of shaded canyons until that sun's got out there. So that's a good rule to get out early, but it's not always essential, and it's not always the thing to do in certain circumstances. On that basis, actually, of having a really good day in the hot summer months, start lower down, work your way up. So there's going to be more activity in the afternoons at high elevations, at the top of Mount Lemmon, for example. And the other place to be in the hot afternoons is some of our great feeder sites, because even though they'll still be best first thing in the morning, you can't be everywhere first thing in the morning. So if you go to the Pattern Center, Tucson Audubon's wonderful site in Patagonia, or if you go to Santa Rita Lodge or the other lodges in Madeira Canyon, or any of the places in Portal, or Ash Canyon Bird Sanctuary, the wonderful Mary Jo's place, then you could be there mid-afternoon and still see birds. There'll be birds coming in when there's a lull, and you may be in a canyon and see almost nothing. If you're at one of those feeder sites at that time of the day, that will keep your birding going for the day. Seasonal considerations are very important, so that's just a general thing with birding anyway, but spending a day in the Sulphur Springs Valley is great, but you don't want to particularly do it in June. There'll be nothing going on. Likewise, because that's a really good winter birding place, likewise, there's not much point being at the top of Mount Lemmon in January. You're just going to be cold with very few birds. They've moved to lower elevations. So making sure that you're in the right place for the season. And one final thing on this one here, and this has become very obvious when I started guiding, is time management. And I've always described myself as a time optimist. I always thought I could cram in these 10 different places during the day, and we'd get through the first 2 and think, oh, we're mid-afternoon, we've got no chance. So be aware of that. don't try and cram too much in. And if you just pick out one place for the morning, one place for the afternoon, that's often the way it works best. Right, back to Jenny.
So now I'm going to close with talking about some resources that we have found through our experience have been incredibly helpful for our learning birds, learning where to go see birds, and learning about identifying birds. So we're going to do a little bit of a parade of resources here. So, of course, a good field guide. This is the Sibley field guide to all of North America, but they have a Western and Eastern edition as well. Let's see here. So then,
more specifically,
this is one I picked out as one of my favorites. This is a book I thought was very helpful when I was trying to learn how to identify books, and it's called Identify Yourself. And it's the 50 most common birding identification challenges by Bill Thompson III. I thought this was such a good book. It really helped me when I was really trying to get really serious about advanced bird ID. And it just goes through some of the more tricky ones. So how to tell female bluebirds apart is an example, or the swallows. So I really, really, really liked this book when I was starting out.
On similar notes, but just really covering rare birds, this is an excellent guide, this one, and it should be more well known. This is Rare Birds of North America. Steve Howell, Ian Lewington, and Will Russell of Arizona, of course. And this is similar to Bill Thompson's book there, but this is just the really rare ones. So if you want to identify Nutting's flycatcher from an astrated flycatcher, this is going to have the best information for that, the really rare, tricky identifications. Again, it's not all the rare birds, because, you know, a rare stork is probably quite easy to ID, whereas a Myarchus type flycatcher is not. So this again concentrates on the tricky ones, but the really rare ones.
Okay, and then let's see.
This part here is a really good.
Organized in stacks.
I mentioned this one earlier. This is Ken Kaufman's Advanced Birding, Field Guide to Advanced Birding. A lot of what I was talking about earlier really comes from this book here. It's the first 140 pages of this are all that sort of just general birding tips, and then from there it goes on to do something a bit like Bill's book by saying, you know, how do you identify ducks, and here's some tricky ones, and this is the advice.
Very good.
An excellent book, similar vein. You've got the Sibley Guide to Bird Life and Behavior.
It's not a field guide so much. It's more in depth than that. It's all about their behavior and their habitat needs, and it's really, I think, an underutilized book by a lot of people. It's a very good book from Sibley.
And Sibley's Birding Basics, again, similar kind of thing. There's a lot of good information in here that you can use to just improve your birding. And then one more, that is some tips from North America's top birders, and one of Arizona's finest birders, Sherry Williamson, gave this book its title, because her tip was, good birders don't wear white.
So they're kind of fun. They're like essays written from top birders, and it's really very entertaining and really instructive book to help you. It's really fun too. It's really fun read. And then we also wanted to just briefly talk about the fact that there are there's whole books dedicated to families of birds. So this is an entire fat book dedicated to the warblers of North America, I think, right? Just North America. So huge, really in-depth book. So there's field guides, and then there's really in-depth family guides.
This is very nice. This appeared on at Christmas. Thank you very much, Jenny. This is the Birds of Prey of the West. So this is great if you're going to do a hawk watch in two-back. This is the one that you need.
That's just Birds of Prey of just the West.
And then sparrows. Who doesn't love sparrows? So there are plenty of different books on sparrows even. So it's not just this one.
And then there's also some online resources that are quite good, and we wanted to briefly cover on that. And we can make a list of all these books and these web resources I'm about to mention and email, because I do have the email list for all of you guys, and send that out. Let's see here. So there's the Birds of North America. Birds of the World is called now. So it used to be BNA, Birds of North America, which is an online resource of profiles of all the different species of North America. It's recently upgraded to be Birds of the World from Cornell. Now that is a subscription service, and it is $7.99 a month. But if you're really getting into some advanced bird topics. It has so much information about every species. It's really an amazing resource. There's also, of course, the ones we mentioned, the Facebook groups, eBird, but there's one that I think a lot of birders don't know about is if you want to have access to bird sounds, there's things like the Birds of the World, things like that, or All About Birds from Audubon, which has briefer profiles of birds that you can then click on some icons to hear bird sounds. There's another resource for audio files of birds called Xenocanto, and that's spelled with an X, Xeno hyphen Canto, C-A-N-T-O, xenocanto.com, and it's totally free, xenocanto.org. It's totally free to go on there and see and listen to all these recordings that amateur audio recorders have put up. Now, some of these people, they call themselves amateur audio recorders. These are excellent audio files, professional level audio files. And if you have audio files, you can put them up on Xenocanto yourself too and share them with people. So that's really a very cool resource for free. And you can actually download those MP3s and keep them, on an iPod or something to listen to. And then I did want to just leave a final thought, which is, and I really cannot emphasize this enough, is that birding is supposed to be fun, and birding can be whatever you want it to be, right? So if you want to have your life as a birder be just sort of birding in your community, in your yard, and in your city, that's totally great. If you want birding to be super competitive, where you check eBird constantly and see how you're ranking against other eBirders in your state, that's also fine. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're not birding correctly, that you're not doing it right, because it's people can do it however they want. Birding is best for you however you want it to be. I think that's a really important thing that we all remember and tell each other. It's whatever you want it to be. So I'm afraid we were afraid we'd be under on info on time, and now we've of course gone over, which always happens with talks I give. So, but we're certainly here for questions if you guys have time to hang on.
That's great. Thanks, Jenny and Richard. Yeah, I do have a few questions that maybe we could get to from the chat, and then everyone, if you want to stick around and have a question, go ahead and click on the raise hand function through the Zoom platform there, and I will call on you. But first, a couple questions. The resources you showed were great, and one question we had was birding by ear guides, and so Xenocanto for sure. And then someone in the chat room mentioned Nathan Peeplow's book.
Yeah,
do you have any other resources on that?
I don't have a copy of Nathan's book here, or I would have shown it, because that's really an excellent book. Now, one of the, I think the best ways to quickly and very accurately hear the audio of a bird you're interested in is through the bird identification apps. So there's apps you can buy, like Sibley has a smartphone app that you have to pay for. There's a few you can pay for, but there's also a couple of free ones. So there's Merlin, which is free, and the Audubon Birds of North America app, which is free. And all those apps do include audio files. Yeah. So you can go to the profile of Elegant Trogon and listen to them as well. So that's, I think, a really good resource for that.
Merlin in particular is getting better and better all the time.
People mostly think that the Merlin app is for either answering bird ID questions or uploading a photo. But the third function, there are 3 different buttons to click on when you open the Merlin app. I ignore the first two. I click on the third one, which is a full birding app. You can download different packs, and it's now, you can, even if you're going on a vacation somewhere, just going back to Britain, we downloaded the Britain and Europe pack, and we've got a full birding app of Britain and Europe.
And it's free.
And the vocalizations are very good on there. It's just a couple of photos as far as the ID part of it is concerned, but in terms of vocalizations, it is excellent. So the Merlin app is really worth exploring, and for free.
Awesome. One question we had was any recommendations on clothing to wear while you're out birding? Someone mentioned that last year when the Barrel-Line hummingbird was in the Chiricahuas, it was attracted to people wearing red. And I think the Olia's red car too, if I remember right.
Yeah,
that's right. And red back as well.
Yeah, so any clothing recommendations?
Well, for me, being out all the time, I always stick with long sleeves and long pants, no matter how hot it is. Number one, keeping the sun off you. It's better to just do that than expose your skin and then have to put lots of sunscreen on. And, you know, the various biting insects and prickles and things you can crash into. If you keep it light, but keep it long, that's the, long pants and long sleeves and a big wide brimmed hat would be my general. That's basically what I wear the whole time.
And really sturdy boots is really important too. Footwear that can hold up to rocks and stuff in Cholla. Now, birders, we're a fashionable bunch, right? So the bigger the hat, the better. Now, I do actually wear, I find myself falling into the bad habit of wearing baseball caps because I can see really well in them. But I do try to remember to wear my big hat as much as possible to keep the sun off.
I'm a baseball cap person. That's a trickier question that probably would take a whole nother Zoom session is flycatchers. That many of the flycatchers in like the Sibley guide, it varied shades of yellow on their breast, and so they're really tricky. What's your 1 minute spiel on identifying like Epidendix flycatchers?
Well, I would go back to that whole idea of the plumage is one thing, but I would concentrate on the sort of harder features like the bill size and shape, the primary projection, so the length of the wingtips, the length of the tail, the behavior of what it does with its wings and tail, if it flicks its wings, if it drops its tail, and in particular the call. If you can hear the call, that will really go a long way to answering the question for you. And of course, that also ties into then having the experience, which you can learn yourself by listening to recordings. But is it going whit or is it going pip? Now, those two can sound very similar. So, for example, you've got the three. You've got grey flycatcher, Hammond's flycatcher, and dusky flycatcher. Those three that we get here that are very, very similar. Different times of year slightly. Grey is common in the winter, or relatively common in the winter. The other two, they're around. And then they all pass through their migration. Both dusky and grey do a little whit call, whereas Hammond's has got a much more emphatic pip, pip, pip. Once you've heard them a few times, that really stands out. You can get that down. Yeah. So that, when you're faced with these almost impossible birds to identify, and let's face it, to look at, dusky and a Hammond's in particular, pretty much impossible to tell apart. That's when you're into the averages 10% longer bill. Well, that averages what, a millimeter. That's ridiculous. You can't see that in the field at all. So you're looking at a bit of behavior and the calls, even a bit of sort of elevation, or in terms of behavior, dusky tends to feed lower down, Hammond's tends to be higher up in the trees. Also, that last point that I said, be prepared to let some of them go. You're going to have to. If you can't, if it won't call, you've seen it for 10 seconds, you thought, I had a really small dark bill, it might be a Hammond's, but and it's flown away, you can't see it again, you're just going to have to put that down as a Hammond's or dusky.
Yep. So true. Nancy, you have your hand up, and so I'm going to unmute you. Nancy, do you have let's see. Make sure I get. For some reason it's not letting me unmute you. Nancy, do you have a question? There we go. Nancy, do you have a question? Nope. Maybe not. Anyone else have a question? Why is it not?
Wait, no, Nancy, right here.
Yeah,
The other Nancy. I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I trying to unmute the other Nancy and it's not working. I don't know what's going on. Sorry, guys. Well, Nancy Phillips, maybe you can ask it through the chat, because for some reason it's not letting me unmute you.
Well, one resource too about flycatchers that's available is Tucson Audubon has a little chart that was made with help from Homer Hansen, but made by volunteer Tim Helen Jarris, having the different flycatchers of Arizona. It doesn't have any photos. It just has categories, like Richard was mentioning, behavior, length of bill, and it has information in a little grid. I'm gonna see if I can find a copy of that to send you guys.
Okay, and if we could have a list of the different resources to put that into
Yeah.
our follow-up email, that'd be awesome.
Should I send that to you, Luke?
What's that? Yeah,
Should I
you can
send
just
that to
send them
you,
to me, and then I'll disseminate that out to everyone.
Great.
Well, I'm gonna unmute everyone now. So, thank you, Jenny and Richard. And
You're very welcome.
yeah. And if you guys have any other questions, feel free to shoot me an email or Jenny and Richard, and we'll do our best to respond. And
Nice.
yeah, sorry about that.
No, sorry, Laura left. It's,
Yeah.
Heather left.
Thanks, Jenny and Richard, for being on here. I'm gonna close this up.
You're very welcome. That's
Thanks,
fun.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Have a good rest of your day.
Is there any comment?